The fire had burned low by the time Kalen asked the question his mother had dreaded for 7 years. He was sitting cross-legged on the stone floor of their mountain shelter, 7 years old and already built like something ancient. Broad through the shoulders, his jaw was set with a stubbornness that had nothing to do with her. His twin, Ryan, sat beside him on the worn wooden bench, quieter, watchful. His dark eyes carrying a weight that no child should have learned so young. Outside, the Werewolf mountains were howling. Wind scraped the pine trees into a roar. Snow pressed hard against the shutters, and the single oil lamp between them threw their shadows long and restless across the stone walls. Elena was stirring the pot. She didn't stop stirring. "Mama." Kalen's voice had that edge to it, the one that meant he wasn't going to let it go tonight. "Who is our father?" She had rehearsed her answers 100 times. "He is gone. He is someone I once knew. He is a man who made a choice, and the choice was not us." None of those words came out. What came out instead was silence. The particular kind of silence that fills a room when a woman is holding something enormous behind her ribs and smiling. Nevertheless, she turned to face them. Both boys were watching her. Rian's expression was careful, measured, the way he always absorbed pain quietly before deciding what to do with it. Kalen's jaw was tighter. He already suspected she was protecting him from something true. "You look like him," she thought. "Both of you. Every single morning I see him in your faces, and I am glad, and I am broken. And I do not know which one wins on any given day." "He was a powerful man," she said finally. Her voice was steady. She had learned to make her voice steady. "And he made choices I couldn't forgive." "Did he know about us?" Rian asked. "A log collapsed in the hearth, scattering sparks." "No," she said. That was the truth. The only version of the truth she could live with. The alternative, that he had known and still let them vanish into the cold, was something she had decided long ago would destroy her if she held it too closely. What she did not tell them was this: 70 leagues south, inside the ancient stronghold of Valdrek, Varek, the alpha king of all the mountain territories, had not slept a full night in 7 years. She did not tell them that he had sent his best trackers across 6 territories, that he had stood in an empty corridor 3 years ago, holding a small piece of green ribbon, the same ribbon she used to braid her hair, found near a borderland crossing, and had not spoken for 2 days. She did not tell them that the man her sons asked about in the firelight of a mountain shelter where the wind never stopped was looking for them, had always been looking, and was getting closer. Chapter 1. Alpha King, a romantic The mornings came hard in the Veyrath foothills. They did not arrive gradually, the way dawn moves in softer places, creeping in slow and gold across still water. Here, morning arrived like a blade, cold air slipping through the gaps in the shutters, frost coating the inner windowsill, and the sound of the wind pulling at the pine canopy above the shelter, restless and old, as though the mountain itself was deciding whether to tolerate another day of human presence on its slopes. Elena was always awake before the light. She had learned in her first winter that survival in this place was a matter of narrow margins. If you were too slow to gather firewood, the cold won. If you were too careless with the herb stores, the trading season collapsed. If you were too trusting of a stranger's face, everything unraveled. She had made every one of those mistakes in the beginning, alone and pregnant, moving through a landscape that had no interest in her survival. But she had made them only once each. She did not make them again. Now she moved through the morning routine with the efficiency of someone who had long since stopped grieving the life she had before. She stoked the fire. She checked the drying racks, handling bundles of mountain sage, fever root, and pale winter bloom, running her fingers along each one with the practiced attention of a woman who knew the difference between ready and almost ready, and understood that almost never counted when you needed coin. She portioned the morning meal into 2 bowls, slightly larger than her own, and set them near the warmth. Then she stood in the doorway for a moment, just breathing. The foothills stretched out below in layers of gray and deep green, the pine forest dense and close. The nearest foothills settlement was a half-hour's walk through terrain she could navigate blind by now. Below, smoke drifted from a few chimneys, and a dog barked somewhere in the distance, the ordinary sounds of people surviving in a hard place. This is enough, she told herself, the way she told herself every morning. It was a deliberate act, not a feeling. You told yourself something enough times, and eventually it held. Kalen hit the doorframe on his way out, not accidentally, but because he was moving too fast, as he always did. And because at 7 years old and built like a small battering ram, he had not yet learned that the world did not simply move out of his way. He made a sound of irritation, shook it off, and kept moving out into the cold morning without his outer layer, heading directly for the woodpile. "Cloak," Alina said. "I'm not cold." "You will be in 3 minutes." A pause. Then Kalen turned back, grabbed the cloak from the hook beside the door, threw it over his shoulders without breaking stride, and resumed his path to the woodpile with the energy of someone who had already decided that today was going to require more space than yesterday. Rian appeared behind him, fully dressed, moving with the unhurried calm that had been his nature since he was old enough to have one. He paused beside Elena in the doorway, watching his brother haul wood with unnecessary aggression. "He had the dream again," Rian said quietly. Elena didn't ask which dream. There was only one, the one Kalen refused to describe in detail, but that left him restless, too warm, and prone to picking fights with immovable objects. She nodded once and filed it away. By mid-morning, they were in the tree line, moving along the ridge path toward the lower meadow, where the winter bloom grew thickest at this time of year. Elena walked ahead. The boys moved behind her, and she listened, always listening, to the rhythm of their footsteps, the variations in their breathing, and the small sounds that told her where their attention was. "Step softer," she said, without turning. "You're broadcasting." Kalen grumbled. "There's no one out here."
"You don't know that. That's the point."
She heard him adjust grudgingly, but he adjusted. This was the part she could not explain to him yet, not in a way that wouldn't require explanations she wasn't ready to give. She couldn't tell him that soft footsteps weren't just forest discipline, that moving quietly through a world that might be watching you was a skill she had developed out of necessity, not preference, and that there were specific kinds of danger she was still, after 7 years, half convinced might find them. Instead, she taught them the principles and let the reasons come later. Pick your footing before you commit. Read the wind direction before you speak. If a stranger's eyes linger on you too long, walk away calmly and do not look back. Rianne had absorbed all of it without question, cataloging each lesson the way he cataloged everything, silently, thoroughly, accessible whenever needed. Kaelin absorbed it too, but he fought it first, which was its own kind of thoroughness. Joran arrived at the settlement foothills just before dusk. He came through on a trade route that touched their area maybe twice a season. A weathered traveling merchant with a cart of dry goods and bolts of cheap wool, making the rounds of the border settlements before the deep winter closed the upper passes. Elena was at the trading post, exchanging 3 weeks of carefully dried herbs when Joran came in, stamping snow from his boots and scanning the room with the automatic habit of a man who assessed every space for opportunity. The boys were near the door. Kaelin was attempting to balance on the edge of a wooden crate, while Rian watched him with the quiet attention of someone calculating the exact moment the attempt would fail. Joran's gaze passed over them, moved on, and then snapped back. He stilled. It was a small thing, a half-second pause, the kind of hitch a person makes when something registers without them meaning it to. His eyes moved between Kaelin and Rian, taking in their height, the set of their shoulders, the particular architecture of their faces, and something flickered in his expression that Elena could not entirely read. He spoke almost to himself, low and offhand, not even directed at anyone in particular. They've got the Valdric look about them. The room continued to buzz around her. Someone laughed across the space. A child knocked something over. The hearth fire crackled indifferently. Elena set her coin down on the counter with a steady hand, gathered her goods, and said nothing. She smiled tightly at Corin, the foothills settlement leader, on her way out. She walked the twins home at a normal pace. She made supper. She waited until both boys were asleep. Then she sat beside the banked fire in the dark, and she did not sleep at all. Chapter 2. Garrick had served 3 Alpha Kings in his lifetime. He had watched the first grow old and bitter, eaten by the smallness of old victories. He had watched the second burn bright and die young, the way reckless men often did. He had served Varric for 11 years now, and what he had watched, particularly in the last 7, was something quieter and far more difficult than either of those. He had watched a powerful man learn to carry a weight he refused to put down. Garrick noticed it most in the mornings. The tracker reports came in with the first courier, before the administrative documents, before the territorial briefs, before anything requiring the king's seal. That was not standard protocol. That was a standing order Varric had issued in the 2nd month after the exile and had never rescinded. Every morning, without ceremony, the latest reports from the search network landed on his desk first. Garrick had arranged it himself, initially assuming it was a temporary grief, a man in the acute phase of a mistake. Doing what men did, searching obsessively until reality imposed itself. 7 years later, the order still stood. Garrick carried the morning stack up the stone corridor himself today. He often did when he wanted an honest look at the king, without the performance of court around them. The stronghold was quiet at this hour, filled with the kind of heavy, institutional quiet that belonged to old stone and cold air, a building that had absorbed centuries of power and learned to keep its own counsel. Torches burned low in the iron brackets along the walls. The floors were bare and dark, worn smooth by boots and time. He knocked once, and entered. Varek was already at his desk. He had, as far as Garrick could determine, been there for some time. A half-eaten meal sat pushed to one corner. The candle beside it had burned down to a third of its original height. The king was reading, not the tracker reports, not yet, but a territorial survey from the southern passes. His expression carried the flat concentration of a man processing information on one level while thinking about something else entirely on another. He was 41 years old. He looked it in the way that battle-worn men look their age, not with softness, but with accumulation. The years had added weight to his jaw, etched lines at the corners of his eyes, and given him a particular economy of movement that came from a man who had stopped wasting energy on performance. He was still formidable, perhaps more so than ever. But there was something in him that hadn't been there before, a permanent settlement of some heavier thing. As though grief had moved in, rearranged the furniture, and was simply part of the architecture now. Garrick set the stack on the corner of the desk without comment. Varek moved the territorial survey aside and picked up the tracker reports first, as he always did. The document he kept locked in the lower left drawer was not a secret, exactly. His inner circle knew it existed, though no one discussed it. It was the original exile order, one page of formal language, written with the kind of bureaucratic coldness that institutions develop for their most human decisions. At the bottom, his seal was pressed into dark wax, his signature stark beside it. He had signed it at the height of the political crisis, when the council was unified against Elena, and the accusation carried the weight of 3 noble families behind it. And he had told himself he believed, that he just needed more time, that he would find the evidence to clear her. He had convinced himself that exile was temporary, reversible, a political maneuver he could undo once the pressure cleared. He had been wrong about how fast things could become permanent. Lady Vessa's exposure had come 18 months later, not through anything Varek had built or uncovered, a fact he carried with a specific grinding shame. She had overreached. Emboldened by her success with Elena, she had moved against another woman in the council's orbit, and this time she had been careless. A letter, a witnessed conversation, a pattern that unraveled quickly once someone began pulling the thread. Varek had sat in the council chamber when the evidence was presented. He had listened to every word with the controlled stillness he had developed for moments that required him not to show what was happening inside his chest. When it was done, when the vote was unanimous, when Vessa's family seat was stripped and her exile to the eastern borderlands confirmed, he had said nothing. He had watched her walk out of the hall. She had looked at him once at the door. He had looked back. That was all. He had returned to his quarters afterward and stood at the window for a long time, looking north toward the mountains, understanding with full clarity for the first time that clearing Elena's name changed nothing about where she was, or whether she was alive, or what the 18 months since her exile had cost her. Justice for Vessa was not the same as justice for Elena. He had confused the two briefly, and the confusion had made him feel worse than the grief. The search had intensified after that. It had never fully stopped. Garrick was still in the room when the tracker arrived. The tracker was the best in the network, lean, quiet, and highly precise with his language. The way men are precise when they have learned that a single error in their role has deadly consequences. He entered without being summoned, which meant the information warranted immediate interruption. Varek set down the report he was holding. The tracker spoke carefully, 2 boys, matching the scent signatures, spotted near a small foothills settlement in the Werewolf region. Mountain raised. You could tell by the way they navigate the terrain, the unself-consciousness of children who have grown up in hard country. Their ages, based on height and build, are estimated at 6 or 7 years. Unusual size for that age. Unusual bearing. The tracker paused there, selecting his next words with extreme care. "One of them," he said, not quite meeting the king's eyes. "The one the settlement folk call the loud one. He has your jaw, my lord." The room was very quiet. Varric did not move for a long moment. Then he set down the papers in his hand, slowly and precisely. The way a man moves when he is concentrating very hard on the physical surface of things to avoid the depth below it. "When do we ride?" Garrick asked quietly. "Tomorrow," Varric said, "before first light." Chapter 3. Varric rode north the way he did everything now, without announcement, no banners, and no ceremonial guard. He took only 6 men, chosen for their discretion and their ability to move quietly through mountain terrain. With Garrick riding half a length behind him, the way he always did, close enough to intervene, far enough to give the king the illusion of solitude. The company left Valdrek before the settlement fires were lit, moving in that particular darkness that exists between the last of night and the reluctant arrival of morning. Over 7 years of following leads that dissolved into nothing, Varric had made a rule for himself. He did not let himself believe until he was standing in front of the evidence. He had learned this the hard way, the particular cruelty of hope that builds itself on incomplete information and then collapses. He had felt that collapse 4 times. 4 leads that seemed certain, that had the weight of probability behind them, but turned out to be wrong in ways both small and devastating. After the 4th, he had restructured how he allowed himself to think about the search. He was no longer a man looking for someone he loved. He was a man following information, one step at a time, no further than the evidence warranted. This is a lead, nothing more, he told himself steadily as the pine forests closed around the road and the mountain air replaced the stronghold's cold stone smell with something older and wilder. He told himself this, kept his eyes on the path ahead, and tried not to think about a 7-year-old boy with his jaw. 3 days' ride north in the Werewolf foothills, the trouble started, as it usually did. With Kaelin deciding something was wrong and acting on it before the decision had fully matured. He had heard about it 2 days earlier. Older boys from the Creswick settlement, 10 and 11 years old, thick with the confidence of size, had been putting quiet pressure on the smaller border communities during trade exchanges. It was nothing dramatic, a thumb on the scale. A bundle of goods short-counted, the kind of slow drain that communities absorbed because confronting it directly cost more than the loss. Elena's settlement had been absorbing it for 3 months. Kaelin had absorbed it for approximately as long as it took him to understand what was happening, which was exactly 1 conversation with the settlement leader's wife. He went to the Creswick trade point alone. On a morning when Elena was on the far side of the ridge checking the upper herb lines, he walked in without a plan beyond the general principle that someone needed to say something and that he was available to be that person. He started talking. He was polite initially and specific. He laid out the discrepancy in the last 3 exchanges with the calm directness of a child who had grown up watching his mother negotiate with people who underestimated her. absorbing her style without her patience. The older boys found this amusing. Then they found it irritating. Then the largest one shoved him, apparently expecting that to conclude the matter. It did not conclude the matter. Elena found him 40 minutes later at the edge of the tree line, sitting on a flat rock with his hand wrapped in his own sleeve. A split across his second knuckle still seeping. His lower lip was swollen on one side. His expression was the particular combination of satisfied and defensive that she had come to recognize as "I won."
But I know what you're going to say.
She sat beside him without a word. She unwrapped his hand, examined it, and retrieved the small medicine kit she had carried in her coat pocket every day for 6 years. She cleaned the knuckle with practiced efficiency, while Kaylin stared into the middle distance and said nothing. Rian materialized from the trees behind them, settled onto a nearby rock, and opened a book balanced across his knees, a battered collection of territorial histories they had traded 3 months of remedies to acquire. He had the air of someone who had been present for the whole thing and considered his role to be strictly observational. There were 3 of them, Kaylin offered. Older.
I know, Elena said.
We were right about the short counting. I know that too. She wrapped his knuckle with a strip of linen, her movements efficient and devoid of anger, which Kaylin understood from experience to be far more serious than anger. She tied it off and held his hand for a moment before releasing it. Strength without judgment is just damage that hasn't landed yet. Kaylin looked at her. She looked back, calm and direct. The problem wasn't that you went, she said. The problem was that you went alone, without telling anyone, and without a plan past the first sentence. You got lucky today. 3 older boys, and you got lucky. One of those variables changes, and we're having a very different conversation. He absorbed this the way he absorbed all her harder lessons. Not easily, but genuinely. She watched him turn it over and file it away. All right, he said. That was all with Kaylin. That was enough. Rian turned a page. He had not looked up through any of it. His expression had that settled, interior look he wore when he was processing something at a separate level from his immediate surroundings. When he spoke, it was to the book. He sounds like the man in the stories. The wind moved through the pines. Elena went very still. What stories? She asked. Her voice came out even. She was proud of that. Rian looked up then, his dark eyes finding hers with a directness that made her feel occasionally that she was speaking with someone considerably older than 7. The ones we've put together, he said simply. She looked between them. Kaylin was watching her now too, the defensive satisfaction gone from his expression, replaced with something far more careful. They told her, between them, in the methodical way of children who had been quietly building a puzzle for a long time, the small things they had noticed. A word she had used once, stronghold, in a context she hadn't meant to. The way her hands stilled when a trader's conversation drifted toward Valdric. A night 2 years ago when she had thought they were asleep and had stood at the window for a long time, saying nothing, facing south. He's from Valdric, Rian said. It was not a question. The pines moved. The mountain held its cold silence. Elena looked at her sons, at their steady eyes, the patience they had learned from her, and the quiet determination she had not meant to teach them, but had anyway. She understood then that the careful walls she had built around the past were far thinner than she had believed. She said nothing, which they both understood was its own kind of answer. Chapter 4. Garrick hated it every time. The king would rise before the camp, before the sentinels had rotated, before the fire had been rebuilt from its overnight coals, and he would simply be gone. No word, no direction, just an empty bedroll, and the cold that had settled into the space where a man had been sleeping. It brought the particular silence that meant Varric had decided once again that there were things he needed to do without company. Garrick had learned across years of service that there was no preventing it. He could post men closer, he could arrange the camp to make quiet departure more difficult. Varric would find another way out, and they would have the same conversation afterward. Patient on Varric's side, controlled on Garrick's. That resolved nothing. So he let it happen, as he always did, and simply ensured the men were ready to move fast if they needed to. The second morning in the Veyrath mountain foothills was the clearest they'd had. The heavy cloud cover that had pressed down on the mountains for 3 days had lifted sometime before dawn, replaced by the sharp, brilliant beauty of the high country in the late season. The sky was an aggressive, piercing blue, and the snow on the upper ridges caught the early light, throwing it back in hard, clean angles. The forest floor was frozen solid underfoot, every step cracking like dry glass, and every breath came out in thick white plumes. Varric moved through the tree line alone. He followed no particular path, which was entirely the point. He was not tracking, nor was he executing a formal search pattern. He was simply doing the thing he had learned to do when the weight of his regrets became too concentrated. He walked through the open terrain, letting the cold air and the physical ground redistribute the heavy burden until it was functional again. He heard the creak before he saw it, frozen solid at the edges, but still running dark and swift through the center. Cutting a clean line through a small clearing where several massive pines had come down in a winter storm the previous year. Their roots had pulled up huge plates of earth as they fell, leaving shallow craters, now filled with snow and ice. Their trunks laying across the clearing in overlapping angles. One of those trunks had apparently offended someone deeply. The boy was 7 years old, and he was attempting to move a fallen pine with his bare hands. It was not the whole tree. He had identified a section, perhaps twice his own length, and had decided through some internal fierce reasoning of his own that it needed to be elsewhere. He had found leverage points. He had tried 3 different approaches, each one marked by the heavily disturbed snow around the log. All 3 had failed. He was currently on his 4th attempt, his small shoulder pressed hard against the rough bark, his boots digging for purchase in the frozen earth, applying force with the unyielding commitment of someone who had not yet accepted that the tree was not going to move. Varric stopped at the tree line. He did not step into the clearing. He simply watched. The boy's jaw was set hard. His breathing was controlled and deliberate, not panicked. When the log refused to shift again, he stepped back, looked at it with narrowed eyes, and began assessing the trunk for a 5th approach, not frustrated, but recalibrating. Something in Varric's chest shifted in a way he had no words for. Then the boy looked up and saw him. What happened in the next 2 seconds told Varric more than a lifetime of tracker reports could have. The boy went still for a single beat, a purely instinctive, quiet pause of a child raised in cautious country. Then his shoulders squared, his chin leveled, and he turned to face Varric fully, his feet planted shoulder-width apart, his eyes direct and measuring. There was no fear, not a trace of it. Wary, yes, the intelligent, sharp wariness of a child taught that strangers required evaluation. But fear was entirely absent. In its place was a look that Varric recognized, the way a man recognizes a language he grew up speaking. The seizing sensation in his chest sharpened into something almost painful.
"You're on the wrong side of the creek for the border settlements," the boy said. His voice was steady, accusatory, without apology.
Varric didn't respond immediately. He was still processing the proud set of the jaw, the defiant stance, the refusal to give ground. Then, a movement in his peripheral vision caught his eye. Slow, deliberate, and entirely unhurried. A second boy stepped out from behind a pine tree to Varric's left. He had been there the entire time, standing with his back against the bark in perfect, silent stillness, watching. How long he had been there, Varric couldn't determine. He was the same age as the first, and clearly of the same blood. But where the first was a struck match, this one was deep, quiet water. His eyes moved over Varric with a calm, the thorough attention that felt less like a child looking at a stranger and more like someone taking a careful inventory before making a considered decision. He said, "You're not from a border settlement." It was not a question. It was a conclusion already reached, simply stated aloud. Varric made a decision. He stepped into the clearing slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He crouched down, bringing himself level with them, and the cold from the frozen ground seeped through his boots immediately. "No," Varric said. "I'm not." He looked at the first boy. "What's your name?" A beat of silence. The boy weighed the question, weighed him, and then apparently decided that the answer cost nothing. Kaelin. The word hit Varric somewhere deep below his sternum. He went very still, but he did not look away. He let himself look, really look, in a way he had not allowed himself to do from the tree line. Up there, he had still been maintaining the rule, telling himself this was just a lead, nothing more, until the evidence was undeniable. But the evidence was undeniable. It wasn't one single thing. It was everything accumulated in a single sustained moment. The jawline, the stubborn stance, the eyes that were shaped exactly like his own, but carried something entirely their own. It was the quality of their stillness and their courage, a bone-deep recognition that moved through him like a tectonic shift. He didn't speak. There were no words constructed for a moment like this, and he understood with sudden clarity that anything he said right now would be inadequate in a way that would matter later. The quieter boy had been watching him throughout. He watched the stillness come over Varric's face, and he watched whatever pain and realization moved behind the king's eyes. He processed all of it with that unnerving calm, and then he spoke. "You know our mother, don't you?" The frozen creek ran on beneath its ice. The pines held their cold silence. It, too, was not a question. Chapter 5. It was the foothills settlement leader's wife who said it, broad-shouldered and plain-spoken. The kind of woman who delivered information without ceremony, between other tasks, as though the weight of a thing was not her responsibility to manage. She mentioned it while she and Elena were sorting the communal grain store, her fingers working through the dry stalk for signs of damp or rot. Their conversation moving through the ordinary topics of a border settlement in the late season. Company camped in the lower pine corridor last night, she said casually, turning a handful of grain and discarding a clump of mold. 6 men, well armed. Not borderland armed, properly armed. Good horses. One of them, with a bearing I can't describe, except to say he looks like someone who's used to being obeyed. She said it the way one mentioned the weather. Alina's hands kept moving through the grain, her face remaining entirely unchanged. How close? Elena asked. 1/2 league south, maybe less. Elena nodded once, the way she nodded at information she was filing away rather than responding to. She finished the row she was working through, made her quiet excuses, and walked back to her stone shelter at a pace that was not quite running and not quite calm. She had done this twice before. The first time had been 14 months after she arrived in the foothills. A patrol moving through the borderlands on what turned out to be a routine territorial survey. It had nothing to do with her at all, but she hadn't known that. She had packed in under an hour. The boys 12 miles north through freezing rain to a secondary shelter she'd prepared for exactly this eventuality, and spent 4 days there before confirming the patrol had moved on. The boys had been infants then. They had not understood. The second time, Kaylin and Ryan had been 3 years old. She had moved them again, and again it was for nothing. Into the cold, the disruption, and the grinding exhaustion of survival recalibrated from scratch. Both times she had told herself, this is what it costs. This is what you pay for safety. She accepted the cost then, and she accepted it now. She moved through the shelter with the practiced efficiency of someone who had thought through this exact sequence on 100 ordinary evenings. It was the way one thought through fire escapes and bad weather, not with fear, but with the grim pragmatism of a woman who had learned what happened when you weren't prepared. The medicine kit, the small coin reserve from beneath the floorboard, the dried stores that would travel, the boys' warmer layers, the documents, ownership records for her herb trade, the papers that established her identity in the foothills under the quiet, unremarkable name she had taken when she arrived. She moved through each item with steady hands and a mind narrowed to the clean simplicity of a list. She was halfway through packing when the door opened. Kaylin came in first. His expression was not that of a child returning from an ordinary morning in the woods. It was something she had never seen on him before, a careful, subdued quality, like energy that had been deliberately turned down. He looked at her, then at the open pack on the table, and then at her face. He didn't speak. Rian came in behind him. He also looked at the pack, then up at her, and in his eyes was the particular thing she had come to dread most in her quieter son. Not the absence of emotion, but the absolute presence of understanding. He knew exactly what she was doing. He had known before he even walked through the door. Neither of them moved from the entrance, because there was someone else behind them. He filled the doorframe the way large men did, not dramatically, but simply by being the size he was and being present. He had to angle his broad shoulders slightly to clear the frame. He stopped at the threshold, one hand resting on the weathered wood, and looked at her. Elena had imagined this moment, especially in the first years of her exile. She had imagined it with the obsessive, the exhausting frequency of someone who could not stop rehearsing a scene they desperately needed to be prepared for. She had imagined his cold authority, his excuses, the political language of an alpha king who had learned to make failure sound like unavoidable circumstance. She had imagined the guilt she would see on his face, and she had decided long ago exactly how she would meet it. She had not imagined this. Varric was older. The years had done the honest, brutal work that years did on a man who carried something heavy. There were lines at the corners of his eyes, deeper channels along his jaw, and a thinness through his face that hadn't been there before. He was broader through the shoulders than she remembered, yet more worn. And he was looking at her with an expression that completely dismantled every rehearsed response she had ever prepared. It was not authority. It was not the managed guilt of a man performing accountability. It was just grief. Plain, raw, and unguarded. The way grief was when a person had stopped trying to make it look like something more manageable. It sat on his face without apology, without architecture, without the careful framing of a king who understood how he was being perceived. He was simply looking at her. It was the way a man looked at something precious he had lost and had never stopped searching for. 7 years of it sat in his expression like heavy sediment. He said her name, not a title, not the formal designation the kingdom had assigned her, or the cold words the exile order had used. He used none of the language that had accumulated around her identity in that last terrible season in Valdric. Just her name, the way it had sounded when it was only hers, before everything else was attached to it. Elena. It was as if it were a word he had been holding in reserve, the only one that had remained fully intact. She felt it move through her, the way she had been afraid it would, beneath the surface where her decisions lived, where the careful walls she had built were load-bearing. She felt it, she recognized it, and she did what she had spent 7 years learning to do. She straightened, placing both hands flat on the table, her chin level, her eyes direct. "You need to leave," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was, in this moment, enormously grateful for every hard thing that had ever taught her to make her voice steady. Chapter 6. She gave the boys their instructions, the way she gave all her important instructions. Quietly, directly. Without room for negotiation disguised as discussion, they received them with a nod. Kalen opened his mouth, looked at her face, and closed it again. They took their outer layers from the hooks by the door and left for Corin's home without protest, which told her everything about what they had understood from the last 10 minutes. Her sons were perceptive in the way that children raised in careful circumstances became perceptive, not precociously, but practically. They had learned to read the temperature of a room, because the temperature of a room had mattered in their lives in real, tangible ways. She watched them go from the doorway. Then she turned to Varric. 1 hour, she said, and walked past him into the cold. There was a place at the eastern edge of the settlement where the tree line pulled back from a flat shelf of rock, overlooking the lower valley. Elena had come here over the years when she needed to think without walls around her. The drop was not severe, perhaps 30 feet to the slope below, but the elevation gave a clean view of the foothills stretching south. The pine forest unbroken for miles, and the pale winter sky pressing down on all of it with the indifferent weight of altitude. She stood at the edge of the rock. Varric stood several feet behind her. She had chosen this position deliberately. She needed to be the one deciding where to look. She began to speak. She did not shout. She had known, walking here, that she wasn't going to shout. Shouting was for people who still needed the other person to feel the size of what they had done. Elena no longer needed Varric to feel anything in particular. What she needed, what she had perhaps needed for 7 years without a container for it, was to say the true thing out loud, in plain language, to the person it was about. So she was precise. She told him about the first winter. She told him about the foothills settlements that had taken her in, not out of kindness, but out of the pragmatic hospitality of hard country. You sheltered the stranger because the mountains were indifferent. And someday, you might be the stranger. She told him about learning, at 4 months pregnant and exhausted in ways she hadn't known exhaustion could reach. Which plants in unfamiliar terrain were safe and which ones weren't. She had made one mistake. She told him about that too, the 3 days of violent illness that followed, alone in a borrowed shelter, when she had understood with complete clarity that if she died there, no one who knew her name would ever come. She told him about the birth. Her voice remained even throughout this part, which cost her more than anything else. She told him about the midwife, an older woman from a settlement 2 days' walk away, recommended by someone who owed Alina a favor. The woman had been competent and not unkind, but she had left the morning after because she had her own family and her own winter to manage. She told him about the hours after that, alone with 2 newborn boys who needed things from her that she was not certain she had the physical resources left to give. I looked at their faces, she said, and they looked like you, both of them, immediately. There was no version of looking at them where I didn't see you. She paused. The wind moved through the pines below. I loved them completely, and from the first moment, without condition. That part was simple. Another pause. The rest of it wasn't simple. Loving them and loving you were so tangled together for those first months that I couldn't locate the edges. I didn't know where the grief ended and the love started. I was furious with you every time I fed them. I was grateful for you every time they slept. I couldn't separate any of it. She turned, looking at him directly, the way she had decided she was going to, without softening it, without managing his response. I'm not telling you this so you can apologize, she said. I'm telling you because you should know the full weight of what one hesitation costs. What it actually costs, not in principle, but in specifics. Varric had not moved. He stood through all of it with a stillness that was not the stillness of someone shutting down, but of someone forcing himself to remain fully open to each word as it arrived, without the protective instinct to contextualize or defend. His jaw was set. There was something in his expression that was beyond guilt. Guilt was a feeling a person could manage, could process into something more bearable. What was on his face was the particular anguish of complete understanding, which was infinitely worse. He did not reach for her. He did not offer the words she might once have wanted from him, the explanations, the political context, the sequence of events as they had looked from his position. She had not asked for any of that, and he understood with a clarity that had apparently cost him 7 years to develop, that offering it now would only be a way of centering himself in a story that belonged to her. When she finished, the silence held for a long, heavy moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and without performance. I know I can't give those 7 years back. He let that truth sit between them. I am not here to ask you to pretend I can. The wind came through again. Below them, a bird crossed the pale strip of sky between two ridges and disappeared. I am here because they deserve to know who they are, Varric said, and because I never stopped looking for you.
She held his gaze for a moment, measuring, as she always measured now, the distance between what a man said and what a man was.
Then she turned back toward the settlement. She said nothing because there were things she was not yet ready to say.
And she had learned across 7 hard years that silence was not the same as surrender.
Sometimes it was the most honest response available. She walked back along the rock shelf toward the tree line. Behind her, Varric did not follow. He stood where she had left him, looking out at the foothills stretching south. Not defeated, for she would have recognized defeat, but settled. He was patient in the way of a man who had finally located the thing he'd been searching for, and who understood with full sobriety that finding it was only the beginning of the work. Chapter 7. Elena had not told them what to do with him. This was, Kaelin decided, as close to permission as he was likely to get. He found Varric the next morning at the edge of the camp, where the pine trees thinned toward a flat stretch of ground that the frost had made hard, gray, and even. Varric was alone. His men were elsewhere, doing the quiet work of soldiers who had learned to occupy themselves without constant direction. Varric was moving through what appeared to be a slow, deliberate warm-up sequence, not for performance, but for maintenance. It was the kind of movement that belonged to someone who kept his body functional, the way you kept a blade functional. Regularly, and without drama, because the alternative was a body that failed you when it mattered. Kaelin watched from the tree line for approximately 30 seconds. Then he walked out. I want to see if you can fight. Varric stopped moving. He looked at the boy for a moment. He really looked, in the way Kaelin had already noticed he looked at things, with a completeness that didn't feel like assessment so much as genuine attention. Then he said, "All right," and turned to face him fully. There was no hesitation, no crouching down to manage the request into something more appropriate, and no patronizing smile that would have made the whole thing condescending. Just, all right, as if it were a perfectly reasonable thing to be asked, and he intended to take it seriously. Kaelin approved of this, though he didn't say so. What followed was not what he had expected, which was part of the point. He had expected either performance, a grown man going through the motions to impress a child, or dismissal dressed up as instruction. What he got was neither. Varric engaged with him at the level Kaelin actually occupied. He matched his energy without managing it, offering resistance that was calibrated to be real without being overwhelming. And when Kaelin made a mistake, dropping his left side on an approach, something his mother had corrected him on twice, Varric stopped and named it plainly. Your left drops when you commit. Someone patient will wait for that. I know, Kaelin said. Then stop doing it. They went again. Kaelin focused on his left side. It was harder than it should have been. The habit was deep. But he held his guard up longer than before. Varric noticed and said nothing about it, which Kaelin appreciated far more than praise. Then came the third round. Kaelin felt it immediately, the slight softening of resistance, the almost imperceptible shift in Varric's weight that opened a line it shouldn't have. Kaelin took the opening on instinct, landed the touch, and felt the wrongness of it arrive at the exact same moment as the result. He stepped back. "You let me win that." Varek was quiet for a beat. "I did." "Why?" Another beat, shorter this time. "I wanted to see how you'd respond to winning." It was the wrong thing to do. Kaelin looked at him steadily. "You were testing me?" "Yes." "By cheating?" "Yes." There was no deflection in his voice, no softening. "That was a poor decision," Kaelin said. "We'll do it again, properly." They did it again properly. This time, the line didn't open, and Kaelin didn't find a way through it. He walked away from the attempt with a clear, unglamorous understanding of exactly where the gap between his current ability and Varek's existed. It was a massive gap. He filed this information away without resentment. He also filed away the response about the cheating, turning it over in his mind. A man who admitted plainly and without qualification that he had done the wrong thing and then corrected it. That was a specific kind of man. Kaelin had not decided yet what to do with that information, but he kept it. Rian came in the afternoon. He arrived at the camp with the unhurried purposefulness that characterized everything he did. He found Varek sitting against a pine tree with a territorial document across his knee. Rian stood before him and said, "I'd like to speak with you." Varek set the document aside. Ryan sat across from Varek on a flat, frost-rimed stone, settling his small hands into his lap with a deliberate stillness before he began. His voice did not carry the fragile weight of a child's curiosity, but rather the quiet gravity of a judge. The first question he asked was bare and striking. "Why did you wait?" He did not offer the softer framings that invited a comfortable narrative or defensive context. There was no gentle asking of what had happened, or if Varek could explain his choices. It was simply the stripped, essential query, aimed directly at the bleeding center of the past. Varek answered him with absolute honesty, refusing to shield himself. He confessed that he had foolishly believed he could master the volatile political situation at the stronghold without having to act immediately. And because that arrogant belief had been fundamentally wrong, and because the devastating cost of that failure had been paid entirely by someone else, Rian listened in silence, his expression unreadable, before moving to the next inquiry. "When you finally discovered the accusation was false, what did you do?" This was a harder truth to bear, but Varek did not flinch. He described the exposure of the treacherous noblewoman who had fabricated the lies, the subsequent emergency council session, and her eventual banishment to the eastern borderlands. He watched Rian process the harsh reality that justice for Elena had arrived through the careless slip of an enemy, rather than through any grand structure or righteous force Varek had managed to build. Varek did not try to rewrite his passivity as a triumph. "So her name was cleared," Rian murmured, "and yet she was still gone." "Yes, and you have been searching for us since before that clearance was even granted." "Yes." Rian was quiet for a long, heavy moment, his eyes locked onto Varek's face. There was no hostility in his gaze, nor was there any warmth. He was simply present, reading the Alpha King with a thoroughness that left Varek nowhere to hide. "Do you understand what she gave up?" Rian asked, not in a broad, general sense, specifically. Varek met the boy's searching look. "I know parts of it," he said softly. "She spoke of some of it to me yesterday. I believe there are depths to her sacrifice that I will never fully comprehend, because I was not there to suffer them.
And I will not insult either of you by pretending otherwise.
A subtle shift passed over Rian's features. It was not quite approval, but rather something far more cautious, the quiet adjustment of a calculation in progress. Around them, the ordinary sounds of the camp drifted through the cold air. The wind sighed through the high boughs of the pines. A tethered horse shifted its weight in the shadows of the tree line, and the low, distant murmurs of Varik's men floated over the snow. Then Rian spoke again. "She still loves you." Varek went entirely still, the breath halting in his throat. "That makes it worse, not better," Rian continued, his tone perfectly even and factual. It was the same calm, detached manner in which he delivered every truth that mattered most. "You should know that it would be far simpler for her if she did not. If her heart were cold, she would have been able to stop carrying the weight of you a long time ago." The boy stood up, brushing the clinging frost from his heavy woolen coat with the practical, unhurried air of someone concluding a necessary errand. "I believed you deserved accurate information." Varric looked up at his young son, this 7-year-old child who spoke with the ancient, the quiet wisdom of someone who had been observing the world long before he had the vocabulary to name what he saw. "I do," Varric replied in a low voice. "I know," Rian said, offering a single decisive nod. Then he turned and walked back toward the safety of the settlement, his pace steady and unhurried. He left Varric sitting alone in the gathering cold, holding a truth that was not a comfort, was never intended to be a comfort, and was perhaps the most honest gift anyone had offered him in 7 long years. On the 4th morning, Varric asked her. He did not choose the rocky shelf or any place that carried the heavy, echoing resonance of their previous arguments. Instead, he approached her in the neutral ground between the eastern boundary of the settlement and the wild tree line, where the earth lay flat and the morning sun had just begun to soften the sharp crust of the frost. They were walking in the same direction, a quiet alignment that had occurred without either of them planning it. Varek came to a halt. Elena stopped half a step later. "I want to ask you something," Varric said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the crisp air. "But before I do, you must know that a simple refusal is a complete and final answer. If you say no, I will never speak of it again." Elena turned her head, her gaze steady. "Come back to Valdrich," he said. The words hung like frozen breath in the space between them. Neither of them moved to break the silence. Far above, a bird called out from the high forest canopy, and a soft clump of snow slipped from a pine branch to the left, falling without a sound into the deep drifts below. "I do not ask this as an immediate demand," Varric clarified, "nor as a condition for anything else. I ask it as a free choice, made by you with a full understanding of what it means and what it does not mean." He did not look away. "What does it mean?" she asked. "It means that Kaelin and Rian will be formally and legally recognized as royal heirs before the assembled High Council, recorded in the eternal ledgers. It means that the injustice committed against you will be addressed publicly, not quietly managed behind closed doors, and not softened with convenient political phrasing. It will be named for what it was. The very people who sat in that grand hall when you were driven out will hear the absolute truth, spoken plainly by the man who should have had the courage to speak it 7 years ago." He paused, letting the cold air clear his throat. "And what it does not mean,"
Varric continued, is that you owe me anything. You do not return to Valdrek to settle a debt. You do not return because I tracked you down. You return only if it is what you truly want. If you tell me now that you have built a life in these foothills that you are unwilling to abandon, I will ensure the boy's recognition is finalized, regardless of your absence, and I will leave this place and never trouble you again.
Elena remained silent, her expression guarded.
There are political alliances and old arrangements at the stronghold that should have been shattered years ago, Varric said. I am telling you now that they will be destroyed. This is not a promise designed to persuade you. It is simply information you have a right to possess. I am not offering you my devotion as a transaction. I am showing you exactly what I am prepared to tear down and rebuild so that you have all the facts before you decide. He fell silent, having clearly reached the limit of what he intended to say. Elena watched him for a long, measuring moment. I will think on it, she said finally. Then she turned and walked back toward the warmth of the settlement. She allowed herself 3 days. It was not a period of hesitation, but rather the same methodical, deliberate process she applied to every choice that carried weight. It was the survival instinct that had kept her and her sons alive in a wilderness that showed no mercy to the careless. She needed to think away from the gravity of his presence, free from the pull of his voice and the complicated, painful remnants of feelings she had spent 7 years trying to lock away. Varric stayed at the edge of the borderlands. He sent no messages. He did not walk the paths where he might cross her route. He had promised not to pressure her, and he kept his word, a detail Elena noted with an analytical precision she could not quiet. What she did not expect was the quiet intervention of the settlement itself. On the second evening, a straightforward, sharp-witted village woman came to Elena's hearth. She sat across from the fire in her usual manner, occupying the space without apology, entirely uninterested in softening her observations. That towering man and his soldiers have been here for 4 days, the woman said, tending to her tea. And the people of this settlement have begun to watch. Elena stirred the coals, remaining silent. He repaired the roof of the common storage barn, the woman continued. The high section that has been leaking since the heavy snows of last winter. One of his trackers mentioned the leak in passing, not asking for help. The very next morning, that king was up on the beams with 2 of his men, working the timber. He did not mention it when he finished. He did not seem to think it required a song of praise. Elena kept her eyes on the fire. He sat with Elder Corin for nearly an hour 2 days ago, the woman added. He asked about our winter trade routes and our hunting boundaries, and he listened, truly listened. Not the sort of listening where a man is merely biding his time until he can speak again. I have met high-born men before. They usually listen to border elders the way they listen to the passing wind, politely, but without remembering a single word. He was not always capable of that, Elena murmured, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The village woman accepted this without reaction. There is one other thing, she said, setting her empty cup down on the stone. The young girl from the end cabin, the little 4-year-old, tripped near the stone well yesterday morning and cut her knee. Your king was the first to reach her, lifting her from the dirt before her own mother could even clear the cabin door. The fire crackled between them. I am not here to tell you what path to choose, the woman said. rising to her feet with the efficiency of someone who had delivered her truth and considered her duty done. I am only telling you what my eyes have seen. You are the one who knows what those actions mean. Elena spent the entirety of the third morning alone on the high rocky shelf. She sat with her back pressed against the frozen stone, looking out over the endless roll of the Werewolf foothills. She did the honest accounting she owed to her own soul, not an accounting of emotion, which she had learned to distrust because feelings were reactions to the wind, but an accounting of evidence. What did she know for certain? She knew she had carved a life out of this unforgiving wilderness. It was a real life, forged from nothing but her own hands, her knowledge of the earth, and a stubborn refusal to be broken by a betrayal that had tried very hard to kill her. That life belonged to her. It did not vanish simply because Varric had walked into it. She knew her sons deserved to know exactly who they were in the wider world, to claim the birthright that belonged to them by blood. She had given them every ounce of her strength, but she could not give them their name alone. And she knew what the small things meant. She had learned to judge men by their smallest, unobserved actions, because those were the moments when the performance ended and the truth remained. A mended roof, an hour of genuine respect shown to an elder who had nothing of political value to offer. A crying child gathered up from the cold dirt. She knew, too, that she was profoundly tired. It was not the simple exhaustion of a hard season, but the deep, resonant voice of a hard war. The structural weariness of a woman who had spent 7 years doing nothing but surviving. She was ready, if the path was clear, to do something more than merely endure. And she knew, with the devastating clarity that Rian had inherited from her, that she was finished building her life around the shape of the wound Varric had left behind. She was done organizing her every choice, her every boundary in reaction to his past failure. To live in opposition to him was still a form of captivity. She was ready to be free of it. She found Varric near the lower camp as the afternoon light began to fail, casting long blue shadows across the snow. He saw her approaching and stood immediately, remaining silent, waiting for her to speak. "I will come to Valdrek," she said. A sudden, intense emotion flickered across Varric's face, but Elena raised a hand to halt it before it could settle into anything she would have to address. "Not for you," she clarified, her voice steady and resolute. "Not yet. I come for my sons, and I come for myself, because I will no longer design my existence around what you failed to do 7 years ago. That is the truth of this journey. You must understand that clearly before we take a single step." "I understand it," Varric said. "Good." She turned back toward the settlement to begin the work of dismantling, carefully and without a trace of grief, the life she had built in the wild, preparing to construct whatever came next with those same deliberate hands. Valdrek received them without a single trumpet or banner. This had been Varric's explicit command, though it had met with fierce resistance from his inner circle. Garrick had argued his position with the measured, persistent stubbornness of a veteran commander. He had insisted that an arrival without formal ceremony would be interpreted by the court as uncertainty, and that the High Council would view the lack of structure as an invitation to challenge the king's authority. Varric had listened to every warning and simply repeated his order. No banners, no gatherings at the gates, no royal procession. Elena had said nothing when he told her of the decision, but he had noticed the slight, relieved softening of her shoulders. And he had kept his silence. So they passed through the great northern gate in the gray light of early dawn, 6 riders and a single unadorned cart. The ancient stronghold received them the way old stone receives everything, without warmth, without judgment, carrying only the immense indifference of an edifice that had witnessed too many arrivals and departures to be moved by another. Elena looked up at the towering walls as they passed beneath the shadow of the gate arch. She did not look down. Kalen, riding on his pony beside her, examined the fortress with the sharp, calculating eye of a young warrior, cataloging the height of the battlements, the positions of the watchmen, and the worn tracks connecting the outer keeps. Rian, however, was watching his mother. Elena felt her son's quiet gaze upon her, but did not turn. She was settling something private between herself and the towering stone, a silent reckoning that required no audience. Whatever Valdrek had meant to her when she fled it, bleeding and cast out with 2 unborn lives she had not yet known how to protect, she was deciding now what it would mean for her future. She rode through the gates without a single tremor. That was her victory. The High Council convened by mid-morning. The great hall was ancient, its stone foundations older than the stronghold itself, as if the castle had been built merely to shelter this room. The timbered ceiling was dark with centuries of smoke, and the walls were hung with heavy, faded territorial banners rather than ornament. The long oak table was deeply scarred by generations of rule. The pack leaders occupied the heavy chairs along the left side. The territorial chieftains sat along the right. At the far end, in seats that had held their predecessors for 200 years, sat the 3 elder wolves, the oldest institutional authority in the realm, whose role was to bear witness rather than to govern. Elena stood near the massive entrance doors with her twins. She had dressed with care, not in finery, for she possessed none, but with the clean. The sharp dignity of a woman who understood that presence in a room such as this was its own language. Her posture was unbroken, her silence that of someone who refused to be lessened by a space that had once tried to erase her very existence. Kalen stood like a sentinel at her left. Rian stood watchful at her right. Varric stood at the head of the long table. He did not open the session with the traditional high court phrasing. He did not signal the scribes to read the agenda, nor did he offer the customary invocations. He simply spoke with the flat, unadorned voice he used when he wanted no room for misinterpretation. He told the raw truth. He did not offer a polished version of history, nor did he attempt to spread the blame among political pressures, council factions, or the complexities of governing a fractured territory. He told the assembled lords exactly what had transpired. He stated plainly that Elena had been falsely accused by a noblewoman driven by personal ambition. He declared that the evidence had been entirely fabricated. And he admitted before them all that he had known the charges felt wrong, yet had chosen political caution over immediate righteous action. My hesitation cost her 7 years in the wilderness, Varric said, his voice echoing off the ancient stone. It denied my sons their rightful birthright. The blame for that failure belongs to me alone. I will not share it, and I will not excuse it. A profound silence descended upon the hall. Several council members sat in rigid stillness, trying and failing to keep their expressions entirely neutral.
One territorial chieftain from the rugged western passes, a broad-shouldered man named Gorvin. Raised on old traditions and older prejudices, shifted in his seat, his chest expanding as he prepared to speak, ready to steer the confession back into manageable political terms. Kalen turned his head and looked directly at him. It was not a threat, nor was it a childish performance. It was simply the look of a 7-year-old boy who had inherited, in its purest and most terrifying form, his father's physical gravity. He held his chin level, his eyes dark and unwavering, utterly devoid of apology for occupying the space he stood in. The resemblance to Varek was so striking, so sudden, that it struck the room like a physical blow. Gorvin closed his mouth and did not speak. At the far end of the table, the elder wolves exchanged a quiet, a knowing look, the look of those who had lived through enough history to recognize the arrival of a new era when it stood before them. Elena stepped forward as Varek finished speaking. She had not rehearsed her words. She had decided only that she would speak, because this hall owed her a reckoning, and she was the only soul alive who could deliver it. She did not weep, nor did she rage. She had not come to perform her grief for the court's comfort, or to make her suffering easy for them to dismiss. She spoke with the quiet, devastating precision she had forged through 7 years of speaking only what was necessary. She told them of the life she had built in the freezing foothills, not to impress them, but to make them understand exactly what their grand system had discarded and what it had cost her to rebuild it from the frozen earth. She described what it meant to raise 2 royal heirs alone in a land that offered no shelter. She spoke of teaching them honor, strength, and their own worth, entirely without the aid of the kingdom that should have protected them. She forced them to look at what it meant for a society to cast out its own people based on unexamined lies, because it was politically convenient to believe the worst. "You did not lose me," Elena said, her voice carrying to every dark corner of the high ceiling. "You discarded me. There is a vast difference. One is a tragedy that befalls you. The other is a deliberate choice." The words settled into the chamber like heavy stones dropped into a still pool, silent but shifting the weight of everything beneath the surface. No one dared to break the quiet. The formal response came from the eldest of the wolf elders, a matriarch whose lineage had held her seat for 3 generations. She rose slowly, her ancient voice carrying the ritual language of recognition. But she directed her words first to Elena before she ever looked toward the boys. With the scribes recording every word, Kalen and Rian were formally declared the legitimate royal heirs of Valdrak, witnessed and sealed by the authority of the 6 territories. Then the elder matriarch turned fully to Elena, speaking words of restoration and honor that the council had not heard addressed to an Omega in living memory. It was a formal acknowledgement of her rank, her courage, and the return of every right that had been stolen from her. Elena received the decree standing straight, her hands steady at her sides. She did not shed a tear. She had done her weeping in the dark of freezing shelters when there was no one to watch. She had paid that heavy toll in full without an audience. What she felt now was not joy, but the solid, quiet gravity of a world finally returning to its proper axis. It was not loud, and it was not dramatic, but it was real, and it was recorded in the ancient books before the rulers of the land.
It was, she decided, enough. Forgiveness did not arrive like a change in the weather. It did not sweep down from the high peaks the way the sudden blizzards did in the Veyrath foothills, preceded by a drop in pressure and the sharp scent of ozone in the air. It did not arrive at all as a singular event. Instead, it moved the way the seasons moved, so gradually, so quietly, that one could never point to the exact day the winter ended. One could only look back from the warmth of a later month and realize the earth had changed while no one was watching.
Elena understood this.
She had watched herself extend it to others over the long years of her exile, to the cautious borderers who had been suspicious before they were kind, and to herself for the small, desperate mistakes of those first freezing months in the wild. She knew its slow, quiet texture. She knew it was not a single decree, but a direction chosen again and again in tiny, daily increments. She did not force it. She did not pretend. She simply lived within the heavy stone walls of Valdric, letting the days stack up, and paid attention to the shifting currents. The first change she noticed was in the corridors. She had expected the passages of the stronghold to feel like a monument to her old pain. The places where the very air would hold the echo of her betrayal. She had braced herself to walk through them with her defenses raised, the corridor outside the council chambers, the great eastern archway where her banishment had been read to the winds. Yet when she walked them, she found only stone, torchlight, the scent of burning pine, and the ordinary, bustling noise of a castle going about its day. The past was there, certainly, but it was there in the way a scar remains on the skin, visible if one looked closely, but no longer tender to the touch. On her 9th morning, as she passed through the eastern arch, she realized the stones had not changed at all. She was the one who had changed. She had forged herself into someone the walls of Valdric could no longer diminish. The woman who had been humiliated in this place no longer existed. She had survived and grown into someone entirely new. This version of Elena could walk the stones without fear. Varric gave Kaelin a seat at the high table during the territorial strategy sessions. It was not a symbolic gesture to please the boy. It was a heavy wooden chair, a real map of the borderlands, and the explicit expectation that he would contribute. This had caused immediate friction with two of the older advisors, who muttered that a 7-year-old had no place in matters of state. Varric had listened to their protests with the quiet patience of a leader who had already made his decision and merely wished to let them speak their piece. Kaelin threw himself into the work with the same physical, unstoppable energy he brought to everything. He did not hesitate. And in his first week, he disagreed with the king twice. Elena heard of the first dispute from Garrick, who recounted the tale with the look of a commander who is not entirely sure whether to be worried or thoroughly amused. Kaelin had openly challenged a proposed patrol route for the northern borders, arguing that it favored speed over building trust with the local settlements and would therefore fall apart within 2 seasons. He had been highly specific, drawing on the small details of survival he had observed in the foothills, details the High Council, sitting in their warm hall, had never bothered to learn. Varric had listened, asked the boy 2 direct questions, and then amended the orders. The second disagreement Elena witnessed herself. She was passing the open door of the map room when she stopped, drawn by the sound of voices. Kaelin was standing on a stool to reach the edge of the great table, his posture completely natural, making his point with the fierce, blunt honesty Elena had raised him with.
Varric was watching him. He was not merely tolerating the child, nor was he humoring him. He was listening with the absolute concentration he reserved for the most critical matters. When Kaelin finished speaking, Varric nodded. "You are correct about the Eastern Pass," the king said. "We will change the alignment." Kaelin gave a single, satisfied nod, the reaction of a boy who expected to be heard, and had been. Elena turned and walked quiet-footed down the stone corridor. Deep within her chest, something old and tight loosened its grip. Rian found the great library on their third afternoon and was scarcely seen at the dining tables for a week. He appeared occasionally to seek out food or sleep, and once to ask Elena a complex question regarding an ancient border treaty, a question she could not answer, which she found both startling and deeply moving. He was reading the history of the realm from the inside out, constructing a quiet fortress of knowledge in his mind. Watching her quiet son disappear into the endless rows of parchment would, she knew, eventually lead to something extraordinary. She let him go gladly. It was the greatest gift she had ever been able to provide for him, not the library itself, but a world that contained a space large enough for his mind to inhabit. He had long outgrown the tattered scrolls she had traded her remedies for in the wild. He needed this endless sea of ink, and the kingdom needed his quiet, observing eyes. Watching him claim it was its own silent form of peace. She found Varric in the courtyard on a cool, quiet evening 3 weeks after their arrival. He was not performing for the court, nor was he positioned for some grand display of authority. He was simply standing in the fading light, looking out over the stone battlements toward the distant purple peaks of the Veyrath Mountains. Varric was sitting with his back against the old courtyard wall, near the northern corner, where the stone had turned nearly black from centuries of mountain weather. He was holding a report across his knee, his eyes fixed on the parchment with the quiet absorption of a man who had forgotten to guard his own vulnerability. In this rare, quiet hour, he was completely without his armor, stripped of the heavy mask of the Alpha King. Elena walked over and sat beside him. She did not crowd him. She left a foot of cold, unyielding stone between them. A physical reminder of the years that lay between their past and their present. The evening was settling over the courtyard in slow layers of slate gray and dusky blue, the torches along the inner wall still dark and unlit. The vast stronghold of Valdric was shifting into its quieter, nocturnal register. Varric did not speak, and Elena offered no words of her own. The report remained undisturbed on his knee. Elena let her hands rest quietly in her lap, feeling a deep, unfamiliar stillness wash over her, a stillness that was not braced for impact, nor waiting for the next blow to fall. They remained like that for a long time, long enough for the first torch to sputter to life along the stone wall, casting long, amber shadows across the ground. They sat long enough for the ambient noises of the courtyard to fade into the specific, the heavy silence that always claimed the stronghold once the day's work was done. The silence between them slowly transformed, shifting from the tense hesitation of two people searching for words into the quiet understanding of two people who simply had no need to speak. Finally, Elena broke the quiet, her voice steady and clear. "I do not forgive you for what you failed to do," she said.
Varek went entirely still, his breath catching in his throat. "But I forgive you for the man you became after."
She spoke without anger, without drama, and without the need for an audience. She delivered the words with the clean, precise execution of someone who had searched her soul to find the exact boundary of her peace, trusting the truth of her statement to stand entirely on its own. Varric did not answer immediately, and Elena did not expect him to. Over the last few weeks, she had come to realize that his silence was not an absence of feeling, but the absolute opposite. It was the quiet of a man giving her words the profound weight and space they deserved before attempting to speak. When he finally did respond, his voice was low, raspy, and stripped of the careful, kingly control he maintained during council sessions and formal events. "That is enough," Varric whispered, his eyes closed against the weight of his own relief. "That is more than enough." Elena knew there was nothing else to say. It was the perfect measure of truth. When she finally walked back inside, she heard the boys arguing in the antechamber before she even reached the doorway. Kalen's voice carried the roaring energy of a child who had taken a fierce position and was prepared to defend it to the death. Rian's voice, by contrast, possessed the cool, the measured patience of someone who knew he held the stronger hand and was simply waiting for the perfect moment to reveal it. As Elena drew closer, she realized they were debating the complexities of borderland trade equity, specifically, whether Valdrek's current economic structure adequately supported the small, vulnerable foothills settlements, or if a complete systemic overhaul was required. They were only 7 years old. Elena stood silently in the arched doorway, watching them. Kalen had his small, sturdy hands flat on the wooden map table, speaking with emphatic, fiery gestures, drawing on every harsh lesson of survival he had quietly filed away during their years in the wild. Ryan sat with his back perfectly straight, his heavy leather-bound book closed on his lap, delivering his counter-arguments with the cool, layered logic of a child who had memorized historical precedents and fully intended to use them to win. Neither of them noticed their mother. Elena did not make a sound. She simply stood in the entrance of the ancient stone stronghold that had once exiled her, in the heart of the kingdom that had tried to erase her very existence, and she watched her sons passionately debate how to make that kingdom better. These were the 2 boys she had raised entirely on her own in the freezing mountain peaks. Without her even realizing the exact moment the shift had occurred, they had grown from vulnerable infants into the very people who would reshape this world. For the first time in 7 long years, the feeling in Elena's chest was not the tight, hyper-vigilant survival instinct she had worn like armor. It was something quieter than joy, something far more durable than mere relief. It was the profound peace of a woman who had finally stopped trying to survive the journey and had simply arrived. She was home, not because these cold stone walls had changed, but because she had changed. She had brought her sons back on her own terms, and the rest of it, the healing, the rebuilding, the slow, honest work of a fractured family finding its true shape, was already imperfectly and irrevocably underway. This story was never truly about an alpha king searching for his lost heirs. It was about what a resilient woman builds when the world strips her of everything, and whether the foundation she lays in the dark is strong enough to survive
when that same world comes crawling back, begging for forgiveness. Elena did not survive 7 brutal winters in the Veyrath Mountains because she was waiting for a savior. She survived because in the coldest, darkest night of her exile, she resolved that her sons would never be defined by another person's cruelty. That resolve was her true kingdom, established long before the lords of Valdric ever acknowledged her name. The most powerful moment of this journey was never the grand reunion in the courtyard. It was Rian, at 7 years old, looking directly into his father's eyes and telling him, "She still loves you." Those 4 words made the pain worse for Varek, not better, because that is the true agonizing nature of betrayal by someone you love. It is not defined by hatred or cold indifference, but by the terrible, heavy weight of a love that refuses to die, even when it has been given every reason to burn to ash. Forgiveness, in the end, was not a gift that Elena gave to Varric. It was the ultimate gift she gave to herself, freeing her soul from the burden of his past. If this journey has moved you, if you felt the quiet power of Elena's resilience, the crushing weight of Varrec's regret, and the brilliant future of Kaelin and Rian, then you are exactly why this channel was built. Subscribe so you never miss a story. Hit the notification bell because the next one is already coming, and it may be even harder to put down than this one. The pack grows stronger together. We will see you in the next story.